In the context of capitalism, I don't think that any economic mechanism is inherently positive or negative. It's similar to how I view violence. It can and usually is used to accomplish evil designs, but that doesn't mean that outright pacifism is an acceptable alternative. Intent is important to the use of violence and also economic strategies. What are you trying to accomplish with it? Like, who are you trying to kill, defend, enrich, or steal from? I want to talk about tariffs in this entry as it's a hot topic right now. Historically, tariffs as an economic tactic gained notoriety during the early forms of capitalism as a way to protect domestic industry. Mercantilism was largely about domestic production, minimizing imports and maximizing exports. This predates any modern notions of GDP or international credit, so the only figure economists at this period had to go on was to assess their nation's economic well-being was the amount of gold or silver held in the state treasury. That was it. The European states just tried to retain as much precious metals as possible through trade wars. And in most cases, the best tool states had to protect domestic production and thereby prevent gold flight was to tax imports. I'm not super interested in engaging with the current administration's use of tariffs. It's pretty obvious to anyone with a brain that they aren't helping regular Americans, and they were never intended to. Instead, I wanted to share a historical anecdote from some of the research I do in my free time. It's important to recognize that the means of production are not, in all cases, at all times, controlled by the same class. Now, I'll be discussing agriculture in the Weimar Republic. And at that time, there were still peasant farmers working the land. And that shouldn't be confused with the conditions or status of pre-modern medieval serfs, vassals, or like Roman plebeians. These families were of a middling status. To categorize for clarity, we'll designate lower middle class farmers as those with 5 hectares or less, and the upper middle class farmers as those with 5 to 100 hectares. In the Weimar Republic, these two groups controlled slightly over half of the arable land in Germany, and the rest was controlled by the Junker class, and they were a group of organized aristocrats who specialized in the cultivation of grains like wheat, barley, and rye, and normally for export. And to put things in perspective, in 1929, 3 million farms were owned by the lower middle class families, so those with the 5 hectares or less. 2 million farms were owned by the upper middle class families, so 5 to 100 hectares. And a mere 29,000 farms were owned by the Junker class. And that only accounted for less than 1% of all farms. But at the same time, they had half of the arable land in Germany. Tariffs were brought back into service once the Great Depression was unleashed upon the global economy. While this was certainly in the interest of protecting domestic producers, it was not used equitably. Since the Junker class had way more assets than the middle class peasant farmers, who, especially during the Great Depression, were either failing or barely breaking even. And this isn't purely the result of the global economic crisis either. Small businesses are and have been less efficient than the big capitalist firms, whether it's agricultural or industrial. The middle class farmers were simply being squeezed more and more as globalism penetrated every facet of local economies, and they simply could not compete. Anyway, since the Junkers were of superior social status and had way more assets than the middle class farmers, they were able to lobby the Weimar government to limit agricultural tariffs just to the stuff that they produced. The middle class farms were primarily livestock operations because they couldn't compete with the Junkers in the grain market and thus relied on cheap imports of livestock feed in order to keep their farms running under the strains of a globalized economy. And again, this was before the Great Depression and, by extension, agricultural tariffs. Since tariffs were set up in such a way that it only protected the Junkers crops, that meant that the cheap livestock feed the middle class farmers relied on were no longer cheap, and it allowed the Junker class to effectively price gouge the middle class farmers because they had to buy domestic now. Long story short, this decimated the middle class farmers. Between 1925 and 1932, 42% of farms smaller than 5 hectares, so that first category, the lower middle class, they failed. And over 480,000 hectares of land, agricultural land, or 1.19 million acres, were lost to the middle class and transferred to the top 1% of German society. Not all of this land was absorbed by the Junker class, though. Some was repossessed by the banks, and after 1933, they were also purchased from the banks for the purpose of large public work programs that the Nazis were constructing for their war effort. Looking at this example in class terms, this was a massive transfer of wealth from one socioeconomic class to another. Though, for better or for worse, most of the Junkers did end up having their assets taken from them at the end of World War II, because they were now in the Soviet-controlled East Germany. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna shed a tear over that because nearly all of these people were Nazi collaborators and used slave labor from concentration camps or the USSR. But I think this is relevant as an example of how tariffs can be more than just a tool of economic protectionism. It can just as easily be used as a tool of class warfare. And I think that needs to be kept in mind as we enter into a new period where tariffs are being used again and ask ourselves, who does this benefit?